Hey everybody, thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm super excited to get to introduce Amanda Littman and let her talk a lot about Run for Something. I looked this stat up earlier today and I think it's really interesting. The last 4 Democratic presidents all got their start in politics at either the state or the local level. And including Joe Biden, who started out as a county councilman, which I think is really cool. But it's also a little bit concerning because I think, as you all are aware, this isn't necessarily something that we've really focused on, or state and local politics. And sort of stepping into that void in 2017 was this organization, Run for Something, which I've been supporting for the last several years. And that's basically the primary reason, is that this is where candidates are able to get their start. And in the last 4 years, they've done some really cool stuff. They've launched some stars like Jennifer Carroll Foy, who's likely going to be the next Democratic governor of Virginia. And she's an amazing politician. They've also, ended some potential political careers of candidates that are on the other side, including some who participated in the insurrection on the 6th. Those candidates lost to Run for Something candidates this past election cycle, which is good. And they've also done a lot of work kind of overcoming a lot of the structural bias, not just trying to defeat Republicans, but trying to sort of change to the makeup of our leadership and make it more representative of what we look like as a country. Some of the coolest stats is not just more than 50% of their endorsed candidates are women, or not just more than 50% of their endorsed candidates are BIPOC, but more than 50% of their candidates that win are women, and more than 50% of their candidates that win are BIPOC. And I think that's incredible that these guys have been able to provide those sorts of resources and help people really come over a long series of hurdles and get their start into politics. So it's really exciting stuff. And I'm extremely excited to get to introduce Amanda Littman, who is the co-founder of this organization. She's the executive director of Run for Something. She's a Northwestern grad, so she can relate to Chicago and Chicago winters. She is a veteran of the Obama campaign in 2012, the Clinton campaign in 2016. You may not have known it, but you were probably reading her emails and helping her rack up contributions for both of those campaigns. She also, and I'm incredibly jealous of this, Barack Obama follows her on Twitter, which is that's just not cool. Like, that's not fair. And finally, I really encourage you to look her up on Twitter and follow her, because no matter what is happening on election night, wherever that election night is, she's got something good to report and good to tell you about. So it's a nice break from the rest of the doom scrolling. So without further ado, Amanda, thanks you.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much to your whole family for having this event tonight. I am so excited. You give a pretty good rundown of what Run for Something does. So my goal for this evening, I'm going to tell you a little bit more in detail about what we've accomplished over the last 4 years and what we're looking to do specifically in 2021 and 2022. I'll then introduce our Midwest Regional Director, Candace Harris, who's based in Chicago, to really dig in a little bit about the landscape in Chicago and more broadly in Illinois. I don't know how familiar everyone is with everything, so we're going to really level set. And then we'll open it up for questions and conversation. If you are here and you have any questions that come to mind, feel free to drop them into the chat. Just make sure to change your settings to all panelists and attendees so that everybody can see. But the goal is for this to be a really open conversation, even if I can't see your face or hear your voice, to know what's on your mind or what you're thinking about. As Bill said, my name is Amanda Littman. I am one of the co-founders, along with Ross Morales-Ricchetto, and I'm the executive director of Run for Something. I was born in Virginia. I went to Northwestern for school. That's where I started working for Barack Obama when I was a senior. Got an internship on the campaign and was hired before I graduated, doing online fundraising. So as Bill mentioned, if you ever got an email from Barack Obama that was like, hey, in the subject line, that was me and my team. I worked for his campaign through Election Day, then worked for his nonprofit for a year, moved down to Florida and worked on the governor's race there in 2014, and then came to New York, where I now live, to work for Secretary Hillary Clinton. Her campaign was a privilege and a joy and the hardest thing I'll ever do, and also devastating, absolutely devastating. About a week after Election Day, I got a Facebook message from somebody I went to college with. Hey, Amanda, I'm a public school teacher in Chicago. They keep slashing our school budgets and our classrooms are a wreck. I want to run for office because if Trump can win, seems like anybody can do this. What do I do? And at the time, I didn't have an answer for him. Because if you were young, he was in his mid-20s, if you were newly excited about politics and you wanted to do more than vote and more than volunteer, there was no guarantee that anywhere could take your call. The more that I thought about that, the more that I realized that was a symptom of a bunch of other much bigger problems in the Democratic Party. A lack of focus on young people, not just as voters, but as leaders. A lack of focus on local politics, which had left huge swaths of the country unengaged as we drove cycle by cycle through a presidential map. I apologize, you're gonna hear my dog squeaking in the background. This is pandemic life. And ultimately what I thought was a really not interesting, really undiverse bench of talent for the future. To me, that felt like a problem we could solve. So when I reached out to Ross and said, I have an idea, let's create an organization that fixes this, we agreed. So we wrote a plan, we built a website, and we launched Run for Something on Inauguration Day over 4 years ago. We thought it was going to be really small. We thought we'd get 100 people in the first year. Maybe this would be a cool hobby. Instead, we had 1,000 people sign up in the first week. And as of today, more than 70,000 young people all across the country have raised their hands to tell us they want to run for office. And the coolest part of that stat, which I'm so proud of, is that more than 5,000 of them have signed up in 2021. In the last 3.5, 4 weeks, 5,000 people have raised their hands to say they want to run for office. We knew this was never about Trump. We knew this from surveys we did over the 4 years. Only 3% of the people who signed up with us ever mentioned Trump in their intake survey of the folks who got on the ballot. But now that he's gone, the momentum isn't going away. And in fact, it's increasing because people have seen between the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter protests and everything else over the last 4 years, just how important local government is. What we have done now over the 4 years we've been in existence is build a program that does two big things. We recruit people to run for office, things like ads and events. And just last week, I guess, we had National Run for Office Day, which is our holiday recruiting candidates. We work with partner groups. We do online programming. Over the summer, we ran a series called the Armchair Chats, which were conversations with experts about campaign tactics and practicalities. We partnered with Now This, which live streamed them on Facebook and ultimately reached more than 2 million potential candidates over the course of the series. We have tried to find every possible way, from TV ads and print ads to happy hours with young Democrats, to try and reach predominantly people 40 or younger, predominantly first or second time candidates. We exclusively work with Democrats or progressives or people who would caucus with Democrats if their body might be nonpartisan, and truly the most exceptional candidates. The second big part of our program is supporting them. We help people figure out how to get from beginning to end, soup to nuts, A to Z, every metaphor you can imagine. Whether that means figuring out how to file and get on the ballot, which, as you know, can be a really complicated process with a lot of unwritten rules, or how to write a GOTV plan, or how to write a GOTV plan during a pandemic when it's really not safe for you to be knocking doors in your community, or how to write a GOTV plan when all of a sudden they've changed the rules about ballot collection and voting laws in the last 30 days, and there's really no method or no path forward for how to navigate this. Our team works closely with candidates one-on-one of the folks we endorse. Our regional directors, like Candace, over the last year, had more than 1,000 individual conversations with candidates running for office. In fact, in the last year, we have done some really amazing work that I want to highlight a little bit. So our candidate pipeline, as I mentioned, is now at 70,000. When we started 2020, it was only at 45,000. We have now endorsed 1,480 individual candidates in all 50 states. That includes an additional 30 for 2021. We expect to endorse more than 400 this year. As Bill mentioned, we've elected 488 people across 45 states. Those winners are 55% women or non-binary, 56% Black, Indigenous, or people of color, and 21% LGBTQIA. I think it's really cool. There are multiple Run for Something alum in nearly a third, more than a third actually, of all the state legislative chambers and on 28 different school boards or city councils or county boards. And that doesn't even include folks who serve in different levels in the same county, like on the city council and the school board in the same place. One of the things we did over the pandemic to help people run for office was launching a hub with materials on how to campaign in this new environment. We launched resourcesforcampaigns.com, which nearly 20,000 people visited. That was in conjunction with the Armchair Chat series, as I mentioned before, that reached more than 2 million viewers. We did things over the summer like running a messaging poll with our partners at the Collective PAC to help local candidates better articulate a message around police brutality and public safety. We raised more than $100,000 for Black candidates running for local office, and another $100,000 for state legislative candidates in Pennsylvania and Texas. We worked with more than 100 different organizations across the country. We've gotten candidates press, we've amplified them on social, all in service of making sure that we are building sustainable power for Democrats. And that to me is the whole, it's the core of what we're trying to do. We are trying to build sustainable power. We don't want to be the kind of organization that drops in and then leaves, or that scales and contracts, or that only thinks about the next 2 or 3 or 6 months timeline. We want to make sure that just like the Republicans have been doing a 40-year plan to win power so that no matter how unpopular their policies are, they can hold on to elected office, we are doing the same, but without the fascism and violence against the Capitol. We have set out a plan for 2021 that is looking towards that sustainability in mind. We have done some amazing work over the last 4 years and done a lot of research and debriefing on that work. And now we're ready to take it to the next level and really dive deeper. A couple things that are going to change about our program over the next 4 years. One, we are going hyper local. Over the last 4 years, about 60% of our candidates have been state legislative races. The remaining 40% have been municipal or school board or library board, that level. Moving forward, we're hoping to swap that ratio or even move it a little closer to 70-30. It's for a couple reasons. One, we have found that it's much easier to win local elected office, outside of state ledge, because the districts aren't gerrymandered. So there's a lot more opportunity to win, especially in red states or red communities, because the map is a little more fair, or at least less rigged. Second, we have found that these local offices have incredible impact on people's lives, even more so in some places than state legislatures, although state legislatures are obviously incredibly important. But as we have seen, especially around issues like police brutality, overseeing a police department is a municipal issue. Housing tends to be a municipal issue. Criminal justice reform is often a municipal issue around the county overseeing the jail system, or the DA overseeing the way that the county enacts police or criminal justice reform. We have seen over and over again the impact that things like county clerks or county executives can have on election administration. Who's carrying out these laws that may come down from the state or the federal office really matters. And it matters which Democrat. It's not enough just to have a Democrat in many of these places. It really matters which Democrat is there. So we're moving our attention to municipal and local elections over the next couple of years, really making sure that we're building a bench of talent who can also make immediate policy impact. We're also, as we've now seen, trying to fumigate the rot from the Republican Party. More than 500 state legislators and countless more city council members and school board members in the Republican Party participated in the insurrection against the Capitol in some way, shape, or form, whether being there directly or encouraging stop the steal and big line messaging. We know that even if Trump is never on the ballot again, Trumpism is and will be for quite a long time. We've seen QAnon believers become mayors in a small town in Washington and run for state legislature all across the country. Just last cycle, one of the Run for Something candidates in Hawaii, Adrian Tam, beat out a Proud Boys leader who just last week got arrested for storming the Capitol. This is not a thing of the past nor an abstraction. This is a real life thing that our candidates are battling every single day. So we're going to make sure we're working with as many candidates as possible to keep any of the worst parts of the Republican Party from grabbing any kind of hold on power. We're going to do all of this over the next 2 years, as well as look to how else we can grow in a way that is sustainable and building power that lasts. We're going to try and do all of this with about $3 million. We have about 20,000 donors, most of whom are giving 5 or 10 or $100. So if you gave tonight, it means the world to us, and whatever you're able to do is equally as appreciated. If you have any questions for me about Run for Something, I know I speak very quickly and sort of rambled all over the place there a little bit, but I'm happy to answer anything you have in mind. But with that, I want to introduce our incredible Midwestern Regional Director, Candace Harris, who's going to talk a little bit more specifically about the lay of the land in Chicago, in Illinois, in the Midwest, and then we'll open it up for any questions you might have. Candace?
Hi, everyone. So again, I'm Candace Harris. I am based in Chicago. I'm actually in Hyde Park, and I'm really excited to talk to you all a little bit about like Chicago, Illinois politics, and kind of like what run for something candidates really mean to like the future of progressive Democrats in this area. So I just want to make sure we're all starting on the same level. So I'll talk a little bit like high level, and then we'll get down more into like some of the dynamics of Chicago politics that make it super interesting and a super fun place to work. So in a nutshell, Illinois is a super Democratic state from the top of the state government on down to Cook County and Chicago and a lot of the townships within Cook County. But we're also going to talk about the dynamics of that as opposed to downstate, because that's also something that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about Chicago and Illinois, and then definitely how it relates to the whole Midwest. So we have our governor, J.B. Pritzker, Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton at the top level of our government, who are pushing through a really ambitious progressive policies. We've seen some really great legislation come through in the past 2 years, everything from like protecting reproductive rights to just last week, we're anticipating them signing into ending cash bail here in Illinois, which we would be the first state in the union to do that. So that's really awesome. We also have a new Speaker of the House on the state legislature level, which really kind of speaks to kind of like what I call is like a changing of the old guard that we're seeing and that our Run for Something candidates are actively a part of. On the state level, one person I'd love to point out is State Senator Robert Peters, who, when I just spoke about that legislation that was passed on the state level, ending cash bail through Illinois, he actually sponsored that in the Senate. So after state legislature, we have our county level governments. And just to focus here on Cook County and Chicago, County President Tony Preckwinkle, also a progressive Democrat. And then we have 17 county commissioners, which one of them is a Run for Something candidate, Kevin Morrison, the first LGBTQ county commissioner. So like I said, Run for Something candidates really are running on all levels and really are like speaking to the future of what Illinois and Chicago politics look like. And then on down to Chicago and the townships, because I definitely wanted to point out that Bill and Kaylin are in Oak Park, which is a township, which is actually having elections throughout the state right now. That's one thing I want to point out, because sometimes people talk about, like, when I've been in a few rooms where folks have been discussing Illinois politics and they're like talking about this year as an off season. It's absolutely not an off season. Actually, we have so many races throughout the state of Illinois. Basically everywhere outside of the city of Chicago should be having some level of election this year. And all of those are those hyper local races, which Amanda just mentioned, those township trustees, city councilors, and smaller cities around the state, and even larger cities like Rockford and Aurora are having municipal elections this year. So there really is a lot of opportunity, and I'm really excited. We're going to be announcing our next round of endorsed candidates next week for Run for Something, and more than half of them in the Midwest are going to be from Illinois, because there's just so many folks running, and we're really excited that a lot of young people are running this year in those positions. So like I said at the beginning, Illinois is a pretty, as I guess what people say, a blue state, especially in comparison to like the states around the Midwest. One thing about Illinois too that's really cool is that we actually have a lot of women of color in leadership on all different levels. But one thing when I was thinking about like kind of, especially to think about Chicago politics and Illinois politics and how it relates to the rest of the Midwest, one common thread that I think of when I think of like Midwestern politics, but in particular Chicago politics, is machine politics. And it kind of sets the tone for how politics is run, even in a lot of large Midwestern cities outside of Chicago, historically industrialized cities. And I think that has a lot to do with just even how politics and how Democrats came into power in a lot of those cities, looking at union organizing, looking at really what it means to build a political machine, organizing your community, turning out the vote, and basically having a system of patronage is kind of how I look at it, to make sure that folks stay in office. A lot of times when we think of the machine, though, we definitely have a negative connotation, just because, for instance, even though it's helped a lot of Democrats get elected, especially here in Chicago, Cook County, it hasn't always meant progress, and it definitely hasn't always meant that young people or the next generation are being able to step into positions of power. But what I really see now, which is super interesting from the top of this, from the state level of Illinois on down to local level, is, like I said, like a changing of the guard. We have a new a new Speaker of the House on the state level who is, he just, I guess I'll say ousted. But, Mike Madigan was our longest, he was actually the longest serving Speaker of the House in the country. I didn't know that. I read that in an article last week. So we're seeing that really people are ready for a change. But when it comes to like run for something candidates, one thing that I've noticed with all of our Illinois candidates is that, like I mentioned, like the whole idea of machine politics and patronage and really like waiting your turn to be tapped into leadership. Run for something candidates are like, nah, like we need to see leadership now, because we need to see changes made in our community now. A great example of that is right here in Chicago in the 49th Ward. We have Maria Haddon, who ran against a long time serving Democratic alderman on the North Side. And Marita's a community organizer. I was familiar with her before she ran, so she definitely had built that support and people knew what she was running on. And she ran and became the first Black LGBTQ alderman in the city of, or alderperson in the city of Chicago. So we're really seeing Run for Something candidates kind of speak to that throughout the state. And really quickly before I pass it back to Amanda and we open up to questions, I do want to switch gears a little bit, because I do think sometimes when we think about Chicago, when we think about Illinois politics, we make it synonymous with Chicago, and that is absolutely not the case. Because really, outside of Cook County, Chicagoland, the state of Illinois looks much different. It actually looks much more similar to the states that neighbor us. We have candidates running downstate who are running in red areas, who are running in areas where Democrats haven't run in years. Had a candidate who ran downstate in the Metro East area named Casey Wicherding run for something candidate. She was the first Democrat to run in that state legislative district in like 20 years. So that's right here in the state of Illinois. And what that really means in comparison to the other states around us is that Run for Something candidates, when they step up to run, we're really redefining like what it means to run as a Democrat in some of these places, because a lot of places have not had a Democrat run for so long. And I hear these stories and with my candidates in like Iowa and Missouri and Indiana, where there's actually a lot of organizing to just get Democrats to step up and run, because there's a new generation of folks who are voting. There's people moving to the communities, and they're like, we need another option for people to be able, for our representation. For so long in a lot of places, there haven't been those options. And like Illinois politics is like more diverse than I think a lot of us discuss sometimes, because we so much focus on Chicago. But like really looking at downstate and the things that, as we mentioned, the changes that can be made on the local level really kind of make you see how like Illinois outside of Chicago and Cook County really looks a lot like the Midwest. But what I kind of think of as far as Illinois' place in like the future of Midwest politics is that we are a blue state, we are a progressive state. We are a state where we have an enormous amount of Democratic candidates stepping up to run in this area. And to me, that's setting a tone for the rest of the Midwest. To be able to encourage folks like in states like Indiana and Missouri, where Run for Something is actively doing work to help recruit candidates, to be sure that they can, that they feel like they have some support when they're stepping up to run in some of these more difficult places. And I I just saw a question come in. Amanda, do you want to come back in to start answering the questions, or do you just want me to go ahead and take this one?
Ooh, I'm here. Bill wants to know, can we talk about what worked and didn't work in the 2020 cycle, including what we might change going forward? Yes.
Go ahead.
No, Candace, why don't you start?
Okay, awesome. So I think one thing that worked, I'll start with the easier thing. One thing that worked is candidates focusing on issues, especially in the crazy polarization that we saw in all the races, especially in races in other states where we were trying to flip state legislatures and people were running in red districts. Really focusing on the issues helped candidates because it kind of took away that polarization of Democrat versus Republican and really got folks listening to, like, let's talk about Medicare, let's talk about Medicaid, let's talk about actual things that will impact everyone's life in this community. And for the folks running in some of those hyper local races is actually what I think was the difference in some wins, where they were really running issues-based campaigns. And it wasn't the partisanship of it wasn't the thing that kind of overcame and made it hard for Democrats to win.
And Bill, if you have further questions about sort of like the broader what went right, what went wrong, it's hard to say, in 2020 for folks outside of the Run for Something candidates, we put in our strategic plan, which I'll drop a link to, sort of a section of like some theories of the case here. Including but not limited to confusing allocation of resources, polling, a Trump electorate versus non-Trump electorate, and any number of factors that sort of went into outside of the Run for Something world, where Democrats went right and where Democrats went wrong, if that is something that intrigues you. David had a good question. Candace, can you talk a little bit about how we help novice office holders learn how to be effective office holders and what our alumni program looks like?
Awesome. So our alumni program, we have a lot of different ways that we support folks. So one is, like, I think one of the good things is that we do is that we provide resources. We connect folks with other people who have run and won in those offices so they can kind of learn from each other. Because at this point, we do have quite a few Run for Something candidates who represent in different levels of government. So we're able to match someone. For instance, I'll give a great example here. I mentioned State Senator Robert Peters, who is in his first full term, but he was appointed and now he's in second term in the state Senate. We connected him with another Run for Something alum in Nebraska, State Senator Terrell Robinson, who just won in Nebraska because they wanted to work on police reform. Robert has literally written legislation on police reform that is gotten passed. And we immediately were like, hey, y'all should connect because the districts are similar and you all can learn from each other. So that's one of the ways that we help. Amanda, did you have anything else you want to chime in with?
No, I think the only other thing I'd add is we do work with a lot of partner groups who help young elected officials, including Local Progress, which is quite literally a network for local electeds, SIX, which is the State Innovation Exchange, which does stuff for state legislators, all of which help provide materials for candidates or for new electeds. There's a really interesting question in the chat from JM about how do we translate winning races at the local level into growing the Democratic base at the national level? Local positions have a big effect on people's daily lives, but I'm super engaged with national politics and couldn't tell you the names of any local officials outside my alderperson. That's a really good question. And I think part of it is that local elected officials control a lot of the rules. So it's quite literally a mechanics operation. State legislators control voting rights in a lot of states. County clerks control who can actually vote. So very structurally, it's an entry point to allow more Democrats to vote, especially in otherwise red states where there might not be as much infrastructure. What we have also seen, and what we have heard from groups that really focus on organizing, especially young people and young communities of color, is that local issues are the entry point. You look at DC and you're like, those fuckers don't do shit for me, pardon my language. They don't care about me. They're not delivering me. They're not doing what they promised. But my city council is. I feel it. I see it in my life. Or my city council isn't, but I can go yell at them in person. It's more direct, and it feels a little bit less like being disillusioned, which allows it to be a really effective organizing entry point for folks working within those communities. Candace, do you have anything to add?
I would just say, like, I think one of the comments that I got during some of my debriefs with candidates is one of my candidates mentioned a candidate in Iowa. She was like, really, one thing about running for office that was kind of tough for her is that like people on the local level really didn't know what it meant for you to be a Democrat in that area. And there was so much of the national like chatter around what that meant, but having her run and talk to people and folks see that, I think that's an important thing that is defining like and will build up to national politics. There's a lot of places, like I mentioned, that literally don't have Democrats anywhere. And maybe the closest Democrat is on the state level. But if we see more Democrats running and talking about the issues and, and talking about progressive issues, then that, and especially seeing how they touch folks' everyday lives, I definitely think that will help build. And I think that's part of the reason why we're even here, to build from the ground up, so we can have a future of Democratic leadership in this country.
That's exactly right. Candace, another really good question. I think this one is for you. How do you work with candidates about reconciling supporting unions, but not police unions? How do they run into this issue? And on the surface, that messaging of like, I'm pro-union, just not that one.
Okay, that is a great question. And it's actually something that we worked with people hands-on this summer. So this is how I would say, especially because in Chicago, we definitely have a police union that honestly doesn't even function like a part of labor. They are an organization, but I really do think that they are separate and apart from organized labor unions. So really it's just helping candidates like message that. Amanda mentioned that we did a messaging poll with Collective PAC this summer, and that was actually one of the things that we polled. We asked people about how they felt about labor unions, but we asked a separate question about police unions, because we really do know that that honestly is something different, especially how it's manifesting in major cities like Chicago. And I don't think it's too much to say that it's something different, especially when you see organized labor just last week put out a letter asking for the president of the FOP right here in Chicago to resign because of the comments that he made following the insurrection at the Capitol. And you saw the president of SEIU and all these, recognized and well-known labor unions being like, hey, that is something separate and apart. But really, I think what we have to do is we just help candidates like message that kind of stuff. And our poll was one way that we did that. Just letting folks know that the voters actually do look at those things differently. So when you're talking to people about that, you might not be met with as much resistance as you feel like you'd be met with.
If you have other questions about that or other issues, feel free to drop them in the chat or the Q&A function. We have another one here from John, who I'm curious whether an organization analogous to Run for Something exists on the Republican side. If so, have you been able to garner any market intelligence from that analog? If not, does the absence of such an analog on the Republican side help establish a structural advantage? It's an interesting question. At a very top level, there isn't an organization that does recruitment of young people for local office, but that's because they don't really need one. Republicans over the last 40 years have had a very concerted plan to build from the bottom up by winning school boards and city councils and state legislatures over the course of decades to build structural power. They did things like win the Texas State Board of Education in order to have line item veto power over textbooks. They've done things like win city councils to ensure that only conservative businesses can have a role in a particular city, or only conservative developers can win city contracts. They have been very intentional about this. They've also been very intentional about not being afraid to primary their own incumbents. They don't give a shit. And they invest a lot of money in these local races, more so than Democrats by exponential amounts. Their state parties have better data and have a more centralized data structure. Americans for Prosperities exists in basically every state and has a year-round presence. They don't need something like us because their party's been doing it for years. It's a very different approach. The closest analog they do have is this entity called the Leadership Institute, which is a nonprofit 501c3. It's funded basically by the Koch brothers. What it does is training for conservative operatives, activists, and candidates, primarily young people. Basically, every Republican operative you dislike has gone through their program. Their yearly budget is about $35 million a year, based on their last 990s, and they've been around since the 80s. When we started, it wasn't just like an apples to apples comparison. It was Republican apples to Democrat garbage. Like there was no comparison. It makes it, I think, really hard because we were starting from nothing. What Ross and I have been saying over the last couple months is that while Republicans are on year 39 of their 40-year plan to build power, Democrats are now on year 5. So we have a lot of work to do to make up for lost time. Candace, here's a really good question for you if you want to jump back. When you run candidates in red areas, how do you connect to those voters who think they are neutral and convince them that it's okay to vote for the Democrat?
That's a great question because that definitely came up a lot of times. And I think the big thing and one thing that we look for in our candidates before we endorse is that they have ties to the community. It's easier if you're coming to somebody's door or virtual door, or however we're meeting people right now in this world. If they're like, if you understand like the way that things are discussed in the community, and also if they know you. I think that goes a long way, especially for like really hyper local candidates. It definitely makes the difference. I've seen candidates run and win in red areas just because of the outreach that they've done in the community. I do think it gets much more difficult when you're talking about it on the state legislature level, because it's just impossible for everyone to know you in some of these larger districts. But again, one, you kind of find out people aren't neutral. It's usually like a hot button issue. I definitely remember some of the most polarized things that I've heard was probably not necessarily like Northern Iowa. I didn't hear, I definitely know that Iowa's different dynamics, but I like places like South Dakota and Ohio, you really heard like the hot button issues that they would hit you with, like whether that be abortion, gun rights, it would come out right out the bat. Just kind of helping candidates like talk through that, because it kind of also lets you know that folks aren't neutral at that point. And honestly, one thing about running in those red areas, especially when we're trying to flip folks, it's really just being strategic and talking to our candidates about who they need to be spending their time talking to. Because unfortunately, like in the environment we're in, you might not be talking to someone who's neutral, and they might not just be ready to vote for a Democrat at this time. But there might be other people that you haven't thought to talk to that are more willing to like talk through the issues. And so as a regional director, I kind of help people figure that out, because sometimes there unfortunately is not a middle area. But I definitely think that it's a way you can convince. You just have to figure out who is your audience.
It's a really good explanation, Candace. Thanks. Another good question from David. Are we facing resistance from engaging young progressives who don't believe in participating in a two-party system? We work with Democrats. We're an organization for Democrats. So to that end, because we try to be pretty transparent about that, there isn't that much pushback. I will say that we do work with candidates who are also dual endorsed by, say, DSA or by Our Revolution or further left groups. Because we do not have a clear ideological screen, we have a set of value statements we stand by, but we are not looking for specific litmus tests on policy positions, which makes us a little different. What we're looking for are engaging candidates running authentic campaigns driven to do voter contact. Where they stand in a particular poly position, as long as we share the same values, is less important to us than the fact that they are really pushing forward on our values writ large. Candace, have you heard anything otherwise from candidates you've worked with?
No, but I definitely know that like, I definitely agree with the fact that like sometimes people try to think that like DSA or different stuff are like something other than Democrat when really it's working within the infrastructure. I will say that like maybe with like Gen Z candidates, I'll say millennials too, because I actually think the way that my generation like relate to the, to party politics is a little bit different. But I haven't really met anyone who's like adamantly opposed to like identifies as a Democrat, because then again, that's not necessarily, like Amanda said, our arena, but we definitely work with people who might not lead with Democrat with a capital D, but they embody all the values, which is what we're really looking for.
Any other questions for either Candace or I? Okay, Candace, I want to first toss this to you. If folks want to do more in Chicago or in the Illinois area to get involved with Run for Something campaigns in the next couple months, what do you suggest?
So definitely look, if hopefully, I'm sure everyone will be on our email list after this. Like I mentioned, we have quite a few candidates that are going to be announced next week. The first week in February that are running in Illinois. Look those folks up on our website, support them in any way that you can. A lot of folks are still looking for volunteers, even in the digital space. And a lot of these candidates aren't too far from the Chicago area. So I'd first say that because, local candidates, a lot of our candidates, they don't have staffers, they're full-time workers, they're parents, they're stepping up and putting a lot of their time and energy, and we're doing what we can at Run for Something to, help them in any way that we can, but they really do rely on volunteers and donations and support from local community members like yourself. So I'd say that was the best way to help folks moving forward. Oh, and vote, because early voting is actually starting really soon. So probably if any of you all are outside of Chicago proper, make sure you're, registered and looking out for early vote, because it's actually going to start pretty soon.
That's amazing. Bill had one more question in here that I want to answer. He asked if we could talk a little bit about the value of financial support early in the election cycle. It's literally in the Emily's List name of early money is like yeast, it helps the dough rise. But quite practically, the earlier that you can give to a candidate, to an organization, to a cause that you care about, really political or not, but especially in the political space, the better. The only thing that a campaign can't get back, the only thing that is wasted is time. When you give early, when you give a year out, 18 months out, 2 years out, you allow that campaign to hire, you allow that campaign to train, you allow that campaign to test and to optimize, you allow them to start their voter contact earlier, which means they have more time to make their case and more time to talk to voters. The biggest problem that campaigns have often enough, and I think this was not biggest, but one of the many problems that campaigns have, and one of the things I think was especially problematic in 2020, was that most of the money comes in the final 2 months or even the final month. You can plan on that, you can budget accordingly. Because you never know exactly how high that's going to climb, it makes it very hard to spend efficiently. It's why you spend a lot of money spent on mail or on digital ads or on TV in the final couple of weeks, or maybe paid canvassing, but even that takes time to set the infrastructure up. So the best thing you can do for a cause that you care about, whether it's a campaign or an organization, is give early, as soon as you're in. The second best thing you can do is give it recurring and make it monthly. Candace, there's another question here for you about Chicago and Illinois politics. Can you talk a little bit about voting turnout during the primaries and how we engage with that?
Definitely. So definitely in Chicago, the primaries are, because we are, a city full of Democrats, and a lot of times there's Democrats primarying incumbent Democrats. As far as turnout, we definitely talk to our candidate. If we have candidates in the primary, we know that the primary is basically their election. And, turnout is really the job of, should be the job, let's say that should be the job of like the local Democratic Party, and, movement organizations. The great thing about Chicago, we have a lot of organizations on the ground that focus on primary turnout. I also have relationships with those folks. So yes, I definitely encourage them to like work for turnout. But for our candidates, it's more so about scaling their campaign to know that they're going to have, that shorter window of time to talk to folks to be able to turn out the vote. Even in 2021, it's a little different in 2021 because most of these races are nonpartisan, even if they're Democrats running against Democrats, and they're Democrats, but they're not Democrats on the ballot. The primary season's not as contentious this year, just because unfortunately in a lot of these places, a lot of these seats are uncontested, or we just have one person running against one person. It's not quite as crowded of an arena as we see like during Chicago municipal elections. But definitely it's about, like, we work with our candidates. Like I have some candidates that, their election is in February. It's February 26th. It's coming up real quick, real soon. So it's been a really quick turnaround. So it's just basically helping them, do what they can to talk to as many people as they can. And just like Amanda mentioned, it's really important to be volunteering and monetarily supporting them right now, because we actually have a whole round of elections next month where a lot of seats are going to be decided because there aren't enough people to have a primary in the general.
Candace, one more question for you from this. What's the Midwest version of Arizona or Georgia? What's the traditionally red state we should be watching?
Of Arizona or Georgia? Okay, so I think that's a really interesting question, because when I think of Arizona and Georgia, we also have to remember that there's been like years of work there to get them to be kind of like these surprise states, but the people on the ground probably weren't surprised because they know they've been doing this groundwork for like 10, 15 years. And now we're just paying attention on the national level. So if I look at it like that, and I'm looking at a Midwest state that is red right now, but the way that I'm seeing candidates run, the way that I'm seeing organizations on the ground, like talk to voters and really build that groundswell, honestly, I think Indiana is one of them. I know that's kind of surprising, but we had a lot of candidates running in Indiana. They have wonderful infrastructure. Their young Democrats are extremely active, and they are working like, a down ballot strategy where they're trying to get all of the seats filled down the ballot. They're just trying to get Democrats to run because they know the more times Democrats run, the closer we're going to get to being able to flip some of those seats on the hyper local level. And just the sheer number of people that ran in 2020 when nobody is even really checking for Indiana. So honestly, that's a state that I would watch in 10, maybe not even 10 years from now. It could, hopefully sooner, we might be saying, oh, Indiana is, flipping for the next presidential candidate.
I know it's not technically Midwest, but I am also keeping my eye on Kansas. I think Kansas is super interesting. There's a Democratic governor there. It is the state with the biggest swing against Trump. Well, it still went for Trump pretty substantially. The biggest swing against Trump between 2016 and 2020. It is a place where it's not going to happen in 2022. It's not going to happen in 2024. But with some sustained investment, there is opportunity there over time. I think that's all the questions we have. As Candace said, if you want to get involved with some of our Chicago candidates or Illinois candidates, keep an eye on our website. If you go to runforsomething.net/map, you'll be able to find a candidate near you. We are endorsing more basically every 6 or 8 weeks this year, and we will have hundreds of folks on the ballot in 2021 and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds more in 2022. So get excited. If you really want to support Run for Something more, we would be so, so grateful. I can't say thank you enough for your generous donation to join us tonight. If there is more that you can do, runforsomething.net/build. A recurring donation goes even further. It really does mean the world to us and our team. It allows us to recruit more candidates, support more candidates, be on the ground in more places, do more research, really deeply support people in the way that is the most productive for them. If you have any questions at all, I'm so sorry for my dog, any questions at all about the work that we are doing, the candidates we're working with, or other ways you can get involved, we'll follow up by email tomorrow with all of this information. Feel free to send me a note and I will get to you quite quickly and make sure that you have everything you need to feel like you know what you are investing in. Thank you again to Bill and Caitlin and to everyone else who joined, and to Candace for spending her Thursday night with me. Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your evening.